I held the pen over the legal document, the boardroom completely silent as my cousin stared at me with cold, expectant eyes. He thought he had trapped me. He thought he could use my father's failing health to blackmail me into signing away my mother's name and honor forever. My hand trembled, but instead of signing, I slowly pulled the pen away, stood perfectly straight, and looked him dead in the eye. I clicked my military tablet, revealing that our entire confrontation was being streamed live to the high federal courts. The smug smile instantly drained from his face as his lawyers panicked. They realized they hadn't just cornered an ordinary girl, they had crossed a Marine. What would you do if your family's biggest lie became your only hope? Hit that subscribe button right now to see exactly how this battle unfolds. The alarm always goes off at precisely 4:30 in the morning. For me, that silence breaking is not an annoyance. It is a directive. My name is Clara Campani. At 27 years old, my life is measured in straight lines, polished boots, and the unyielding structure of the United States Marine Corps. As a staff sergeant specializing in logistics and operations, my entire day is spent managing complicated movements, analyzing risks, and ensuring that everything arrives exactly where it belongs. I am trained to be the calmest person in any room, to look at a crisis, break it down into manageable numbers, and execute a plan without letting emotion cloud my judgment. But while the military taught me how to stand tall, my true foundation has always been waiting for me back at home. Home is a modest, sunlit bungalow nestled in a quiet neighborhood of San Diego, just a short drive from the base. It is a house filled with the scent of old wood, fresh coffee, and the gentle hum of a radio playing soft jazz in the kitchen. This is where my father, Thomas Company, lives. He is a retired carpenter whose hands are mapped with the lines of decades of hard, honest work. Ever since I can remember, it has just been the two of us. My mother left us when I was just a toddler, a painful fact that my father never spoke about. Not out of anger, but out of a deep, quiet sadness that always seemed to linger in his eyes whenever her name was mentioned. Despite her absence, our household was defined by harmony and warmth. Our morning routine is a sacred ritual. Every day before I put on my uniform, I walk into the kitchen to find my father already standing by the stove, brewing a fresh pot of coffee. We do not need many words to understand each other. A simple nod, a warm smile, and the comfortable silence of shared breakfast are enough to ground me for whatever challenges the military might throw my way. My father is my anchor, the one who taught me that true strength does not come from the uniform you wear, but from the integrity of your actions and the loyalty you show to the people you love. Economically, we live a comfortable but highly disciplined life. We do not have luxury cars or expensive vacations, but our bills are paid on time, and our small home is pristine and filled with love. Every dollar is accounted for in my neat spreadsheets, ensuring that my father has everything he needs for a peaceful retirement. As I look at him across the kitchen table, watching the gentle morning light trace the graying hair at his temples, I feel a profound sense of peace. I have built a safe, predictable world here. I am a daughter protecting her father, a Marine serving her country, and a woman who believes that as long as we have this home and each other, nothing can truly break us. I pick up my covers, give my father a quick hug, and step out the front door, completely unaware that the fragile peace we built is about to face its ultimate test. The drive to the base is smooth, the California sunrise painting the sky in soft shades of amber and gold. Everything about my day unfolds with comforting predictability. On base, I am in my element. I review manifestos, coordinate transport schedules, and oversee the distribution of vital equipment. My colleagues know me as someone who never loses her cool, a logistics specialist who treats every challenge as a puzzle waiting to be solved. My long-term ambition is clear and well-defined. I am working tirelessly toward earning my commission as an officer. Becoming a captain or a major isn't just about personal pride or a higher rank. It is about securing a guaranteed, comfortable pension that will allow my father to live out his golden years without a single financial worry. He spent his entire life building things for others with his own two hands, and my ultimate dream is to build a fortress of security around him. I want to buy him that small cabin near the mountains he always talked about, where he can sit on a porch and listen to the birds without a care in the world. When my shift ends, I return to our sunlit bungalow, the familiar scent of pine and warmth greeting me at the door. Dinner is another cherished anchor in our daily life. Tonight, my father has prepared his signature pot roast, and as we sit together at the small wooden dining table, he asks about my day on the base. We laugh about the minor bureaucratic hurdles I had to jump through, and he shares stories about the neighbors. Looking at him, listening to his deep, gentle voice, I feel an overwhelming wave of gratitude. We don't need a massive mansion or an extravagant lifestyle. This simple, harmonious life we have carved out together in San Diego is more than enough. It is my sanctuary. Yet, looking back, that was the evening. The very first shadow crept into our perfect world. It was a subtle thing, so minor that my analytical mind brushed it aside at the time. As my father reached across the table to pass me the water pitcher, I noticed a distinct involuntary tremor in his right hand. The glass rattled slightly against the ceramic pitcher. When he realized I was watching, he quickly pulled his hand back, gripping his napkin tightly to steady himself. He offered me a quick, reassuring smile, but the warmth in his eyes couldn't completely hide a sudden flicker of deep exhaustion. Later that night, as I lay in bed reviewing my logistics spreadsheets, a strange sound echoed through the quiet house. It was a deep raspy cough coming from his bedroom, a sound he tried desperately to muffle with his pillow. I sat up, my heart tightening with a sudden, inexplicable knot of worry. I told myself it was just a common seasonal cold, or perhaps just fatigue from a long day of working in his garage. After all, my father was a strong, resilient man who rarely complained about anything. I closed my laptop, forced the rising anxiety down, and closed my eyes, desperately clinging to the peaceful routine of our lives, completely blind to the fact that the quiet before the storm was already drawing to an end. Within 24 hours, my request was approved, and I found myself on an overnight flight crossing the Atlantic. I spent the entire 15-hour journey staring out the window into the dark void, my analytical mind mapping out our legal standing, reviewing the digital copies of the will the lawyer had sent, and bracing myself for the battle ahead. I wasn't traveling as a grieving granddaughter. I was a Marine entering hostile territory, driven by the absolute necessity of saving my father's life. When I landed in Berlin, the crisp European air felt sharp against my face. A private vehicle arranged by the law firm drove me straight to the prestigious David Company estate, located in an affluent, historic district of the city. The estate was a massive, intimidating fortress of gray stone, surrounded by high iron gates and guarded by private security. It radiated old wealth and absolute authority. I was led into a grand oak-paneled boardroom where the air was thick with tension. Waiting for me were the primary antagonists, the core members of the General's corporate board, led by my cousin, Julian Company. Julian was a sharp-dressed, ambitious man with cold, calculating eyes who looked at my simple civilian clothes and military posture with clear disdain. He didn't see a cousin, he saw an American intruder threatening his absolute control over the family empire. The formal reading of the will had barely begun when Julian's legal team launched their strike. They presented a mountain of complex legal injunctions, arguing that because I had been raised outside of Germany and had no formal connection to the family business, my claim to the $45 million was invalid. Julian smoothly explained that the board had voted unanimously to place a temporary freeze on all of the general's personal funds pending a full multi-year internal investigation. I felt a surge of hot anger rush through my veins, but I forced my expression to remain completely neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. I looked Julian dead in the eye and explained that my father was in a hospital bed in San Diego, and I required immediate clearance for an emergency medical withdrawal. Julian merely smiled, a hollow, patronizing expression, and stated that the rules were the rules, and family sentimentality could not override corporate protocol. The rest of the board members nodded in cold agreement. Viewing me as just a desperate girl they could easily intimidate into submission. They knew exactly how vulnerable I was. The pressure was suffocating, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just protecting their wealth. They were actively trying to run out the clock on my father's life, using their immense legal machinery to trap me in Berlin while his time slipped away. Over the next 48 hours, I worked with the independent lawyer, Reinert, to fight the injunction. I applied my military logistics training to the problem, breaking down the corporate bylaws, looking for loopholes, and drafting emergency counter-appeals to force a partial release of the funds. But every strategic move I made was met with a brutal, bureaucratic counter. Julian's legal team was massive and deeply entrenched in the Berlin financial system. Every court clerk we spoke to, every judge we petitioned, seemed to hesitate the moment the company family name was mentioned. My emergency appeals were repeatedly delayed, buried under mountains of red tape, or flatly rejected on technicalities. The system was rigged, heavily biased in favor of the old dynasty, and my structured logical approach was failing against their absolute corruption. The devastating breaking point came on a Friday evening. I was sitting on a cold stone bench in a sprawling, foggy Berlin park just outside the courthouse when my phone rang. It was the head physician from San Diego. His voice was quiet, stripped of the usual clinical detachment. He informed me that my father's respiratory functions had dropped significantly over the last 24 hours. Without the experimental treatment, his organs would begin to fail. He had, at most, less than 2 weeks left. When the call ended, the phone felt heavy in my hand. For the first time in my entire life, the stoic armor I wore as a Marine completely cracked. I sat alone in that foreign city, surrounded by towering gray buildings and a language I didn't understand, feeling utterly defeated, powerless, and isolated. All my training, all my discipline, and all my strategic planning couldn't save the one person who mattered most to me. The $45 million was just a cruel illusion, numbers on a screen that I couldn't touch while my father's life ebbed away thousands of miles across the ocean. Just as the darkness of despair threatened to consume me, Herr Reinhardt walked up to the bench, holding a small, rusted iron key. He explained that before General David passed away, he had left a final, private instruction with the firm provision that could only be executed if I faced absolute resistance from the board. The key belonged to an old, forgotten safety deposit box, hidden deep within the private archives of the General Esse Personal Bija. Reinhardt admitted he didn't know what was inside, but it was the very last piece of my grandfather's personal estate that Julian's lawyers hadn't managed to legally freeze. It was a tiny, fragile thread of hope, but in that moment of absolute darkness, it was the only light I had left. I stood up, wiped a solitary tear from my cheek, and steeled my resolve. The conventional legal battle was over. It was time to find out what the general had truly left behind. The illusion of safety shattered less than 48 hours later. I was in the middle of a high-priority inventory audit at the base, when my personal phone buzzed repeatedly in my pocket. Seeing my father's name on the screen, an immediate chill ran down my spine. He knew never to call during my duty hours, unless it was an absolute emergency. I answered, only to hear the panicked voice of our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable. She told me that she had found my father collapsed on our front lawn, unconscious, beside his favorite gardening tools. My military training instantly took over. I didn't cry. Nor did I panic. Within minutes, I had secured an emergency leave pass, signed over my logbooks to my sergeant, and was driving toward the San Diego Community Hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, the sterile smell of the hospital and the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the waiting room clock felt like a physical weight. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor in blue scrubs stepped out to speak with me. The diagnosis was a heavy blow, a rare, highly aggressive neurological illness that was rapidly deteriorating his motor functions. The doctor explained that standard medical treatments would only prolong his discomfort. His only real hope was a specialized experimental therapy program, but it came with a staggering price tag that our standard military insurance flatly refused to cover. I stood in that corridor, absorbing the news like a soldier taking a hit on the battlefield. I didn't break down. Instead, I immediately pulled out my notebook and began calculating our savings, our home equity, and every asset we owned, desperately trying to stretch our modest resources to cover a mountain of medical debt. It was exactly at that moment of peak vulnerability that my phone vibrated again. This time, it was an unfamiliar, international number displaying a country code from Germany. Annoyed by the distraction, I pressed the speakerphone button. A sharp, formal voice, with a distinct European accent, spoke on the other end, introducing himself as a senior legal representative from a prestigious law firm in Berlin. The lawyer cleared his throat and delivered a sentence that made absolutely no sense to my structured world. He stated that my grandfather, General David Company, had passed away, and according to his final will and testament, he had left me a sole inheritance of $45 million. I stared at the phone in disbelief. General David Company. I had never heard that name in my entire life. My father's last name was Company, yes, but he had always told me we had no living relatives left. $45 million sounded like a cruel, automated telemarketing scam designed to prey on desperate people. Without saying a word, I firmly pressed the red button to disconnect the call, tossing the phone onto the waiting room chair. I had real, immediate problems to solve here in San Diego, and I could not waste a single second on international fairy tales. I walked back into my father's hospital room, pulling a chair close to his bedside, watching his pale face as he slept. Completely unaware that this rejected phone call was the first thread unraveling a 25-year-old tapestry of lies. Over the next 3 days, my father's condition worsened. The tremor in his hand grew into a constant, debilitating weakness that left him unable to lift a cup of water. Every hour mattered, and the hospital administration reminded me daily that the deadline to deposit the initial funds for the experimental therapy was fast approaching. Determined to save him, I gathered all our financial records and applied for an emergency medical loan through a specialized military credit union. With my pristine service record and steady income, I was certain it would be approved. But when I met with the loan officer, she looked at her screen with a deeply troubled expression. She explained, with genuine apology, that my application had been flagged and denied from a higher authority. A sudden, mysterious restriction had been placed on my father's old military discharge file, locking his credit and rendering him ineligible for financial assistance. It felt like an invisible wall had been erected around us overnight, deliberately cutting off our escape. Desperate, exhausted, and feeling the walls close in, I sat in the hospital cafeteria with my head in my hands. That was when my phone buzzed again. The same international number from Berlin appeared on the screen. This time, I didn't hang up, I answered, my voice tight with defensive anger, demanding to know who they really were and why they were targeting my family. The lawyer on the other end remained completely calm. He told me that if I wanted to understand why my father's medical loans were being blocked in America, I needed to look at the powerful family empire in Germany. He explained that General David Company was not a myth. He was one of the most influential, wealthy military figures in modern European history. More importantly, the lawyer dropped a bombshell that shattered my entire reality. My mother had never abandoned us. 25 years ago, she had discovered a massive web of financial corruption within the general's military corporate empire. To protect her husband and her toddler daughter from the dangerous fallout, and under severe legal coercion from the general's powerful inner circle, she had agreed to disappear. They forced her into exile, stripped her of her identity, and threatened to destroy my father's life if she ever tried to contact us. My father had kept the secret all these years, enduring the heartbreak in absolute silence to keep me safe. The $45 million wasn't a scam. It was a massive, guilt-ridden legacy left directly to me by a grandfather who realized his sins too late. But the lawyer warned me that the general's inner circle, the corrupt board members who had erased my mother, actively trying to contest the will, using their global influence to freeze my family's assets to keep me from claiming what was mine. I looked through the glass window at my father, who was breathing heavily with the help of an oxygen mask. The life I knew was completely gone. The peace I had cherished was built on a foundation of profound sacrifice and institutional betrayal. Tears of grief and fury stung my eyes, but I forced them back. My father had protected me for 25 years by taking the blows in silence. Now, it was my turn to fight for him. I stood up, walked out of the hospital, and began preparing my emergency leave paperwork for Berlin. That same night, under the cover of a dense Berlin fog, Heir, Reinhardt, and I used the rusted iron key to gain access to the private archives in the basement of the General Isagram Bija. Inside the dusty, forgotten safe deposit box, we didn't find money. Instead, we uncovered a thick, leather-bound ledger containing the original, unedited military corporate records from 25 years ago. As I flipped through the pages, my breath hitched. There it was, in black and white. irrefutable proof of the massive financial corruption my mother had discovered, alongside the signed directives by Julian's father and the current board members to frame her, falsify my father's military record, and force her into exile. This wasn't just corporate greed, it was a systemic conspiracy that had destroyed my family. Before I could even process the magnitude of the discovery, the heavy oak doors of the archive room swung open. Julian stepped into the room, flanked by two imposing corporate security officers and the board's chief legal counsel. The trap had sprung. They had been monitoring the villa, waiting for me to make a desperate move. The atmosphere in the room instantly became suffocatingly tense, the air thick with hostility. Julian looked at the ledger in my hands, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He didn't deny the evidence. Instead, he signaled his lawyer, who calmly stepped forward and placed a thick document on the table in front of me. It was a formal, ironclad, non-disclosure agreement. Julian's voice was smooth, devoid of any empathy, as he laid out the ultimatum. He told me that if I signed the agreement, legally binding myself to destroy the ledger, renounce my mother's name, and walk away from her honor forever, the board would immediately release $10 million in cash directly to the San Diego hospital tonight. My father would be saved within the hour. But if I refused, Julian promised they would tie up the ledger and the $45 million inheritance in international courts for the next 10 years. I would leave Germany with absolutely nothing, and my father would run out of time before the first legal hearing even began. I stood there, the weight of the universe crushing down on my shoulders. Every single effort, every legal appeal, and every strategic calculation I had made over the past week had failed completely. I was totally cornered, stripped of my options, and facing the highest level of pressure I had ever experienced in my life. The security guards stood like statues, blocking the exit. Julian stood across from me, a smug smile of victory playing on his lips, confident that he had broken me. I looked down at the document, then at the ledger that held my mother's stolen honor, and my mind raced back to my father's pale face in the hospital bed. I was being asked to choose between my mother's legacy and my father's life. It was a brutal, agonizing choice, a moment of absolute crisis, where any decision felt like a devastating defeat. Julian's smile widened as he pushed a pen toward me, convinced that the American Marine had finally been backed into a corner she couldn't escape. I stared at the signature line on the document, my heart pounding against my ribs. But as I touched the pen, a profound clarity washed over me. I remembered what my father had told me back in our quiet kitchen in San Diego. True strength comes from integrity, and honor is not something you trade when the world gets dark. If I signed this corrupt compromise, I would be destroying the very values my father had sacrificed his entire life to protect. I pulled my hand back from the pen. I stood up perfectly straight, adopting the formal posture of a United States Marine, and looked Julian dead in the eye with absolute unyielding dignity. I told him that I would not sign his paper, nor would I ever let him erase my mother's name again. Julian's face hardened, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, as he reminded me that my refusal meant my father would have nothing, and that I had just signed his final sentence. He signaled his security guards to confiscate the ledger from the table, but I was already 3 steps ahead of him. My logistical training had taught me never to enter an operation without analyzing every single contingency. While looking through the ledger moments before, my eyes had locked onto a specific, highlighted legal reference at the very back, a piece of forgotten history known as the General's Final Order. It was an absolute, emergency military corporate clause that my grandfather had personally written into the original founding charter of the company empire decades ago. The clause stated that if any verified evidence of systemic internal corruption or criminal duress against a direct bloodline heir was brought directly before the high federal courts of Berlin, the entire corporate board would be stripped of their administrative authority immediately, and all assets would be automatically frozen under state custody until a full restructuring was complete. Before entering the villa, I had instructed Herr Reinhardt to establish a live, secure digital uplink with the duty magistrate of the High Court, just in case we found what we were looking for. I quietly reached into my pocket, pulled out my military-issue tablet, and revealed that the entire confrontation, including Julian's explicit admission of the fraud and his attempt to blackmail me into destroying the ledger, had been streamed and recorded directly into the federal court's legal repository in real time. The smug confidence completely drained from Julian's face, leaving him turning a sickly shade of pale. The board's chief legal counsel took one look at the tablet, grabbed Julian's arm, and whispered frantically that the transmission was legally binding and completely unstoppable. The security guards froze in their tracks, realizing they were now part of a federal criminal record. With quiet, powerful authority, I closed the leather ledger, packed it into my bag, and walked past the stunned, silent antagonists without a single word of anger. I stepped out of the villa and into the crisp Berlin night air, knowing that the chessboard had been completely flipped. I had not broken, I had not compromised my family's honor, and the real transition of power had officially begun. The reaction from the high federal courts of Berlin was immediate and decisive. Armed with the irrefutable digital evidence and the original ledger, the duty magistrate acted with absolute efficiency. By noon the following day, a federal injunction was formally issued, completely bypassing Julian and his legal team. The corrupt corporate board was stripped of its administrative power in a matter of hours. Under the strict terms of the general's final order, their authority was legally dissolved, and the entire estate was placed under federal receivership. Julian and his inner circle were quietly escorted out of the corporate headquarters by court officials, facing immediate asset freezes, massive financial restitution demands, and a public disgrace that ruined their standing in European business circles forever. There was no shouting, no dramatic scenes, and not a single drop of violence, just the slow, heavy, and unstoppable wheel of justice grinding them down. With the corrupt board removed, the court immediately verified my identity as the sole, legitimate heir to General David Company's personal estate. The freeze on the $45 million was lifted instantly. Standing inside Heir Reinhardt's office, I watched as the senior accountant executed the primary directive I had traveled across the world to complete. With a single stroke of a key, the initial emergency funds were wired directly across the Atlantic to the San Diego Community Hospital. 2 hours later, my phone vibrated in my hand. Primera answered it, my heart throat high, to hear the voice of my father's lead physician. He confirmed that the funds had arrived in full and that the hospital had already secured the specialized, experimental neurological therapy. My father had been moved into the private medical wing, and the first round of treatment was already being administered. The doctor told me that his vital signs were already stabilizing and that for the first time in weeks, his long-term prognosis looked exceptionally bright. I collapsed into a chair in the law office, a massive, overwhelming wave of relief washing over me. Tears of pure joy, which I had held back through every interrogation and tactical confrontation, finally spilled down my cheeks. The heavy burden I had carried since the day my father collapsed was lifted. The system that had been used to hurt my mother and suppress my father had been completely dismantled by the very rules my grandfather had left behind. I looked out the window at the Berlin skyline, the sun finally breaking through the dense gray fog, bathing the historic city in a warm, clear light. I had arrived in Germany as a desperate, detritan marine fighting an invisible enemy. I was leaving as a woman who had reclaimed her family's legacy, secured her father's survival, and cleared the path for a brand new beginning. I packed my military duffel bag, thanked Herr Reinhardt for his unwavering loyalty, and boarded the first flight back to the United States, eager to finally return to the sanctuary I had fought so hard to protect. The journey back to San Diego felt entirely different from the flight to Berlin. The dark anxiety that had tightly gripped my chest was completely gone, replaced by a deep, enduring sense of peace and accomplishment. 6 months later, the warm California afternoon sun is bathing our modest bungalow in a beautiful golden light. The air is filled with the familiar, comforting scent of fresh wood and brewing coffee. On the front porch, sitting comfortably in a sturdy rocking chair he built with his own 2 hands, is my father. The experimental therapy worked miracles. The debilitating tremors in his hands are completely gone. His strength has returned, and the heavy exhaustion that once clouded his eyes has been replaced by a bright, vibrant spark of life. I step onto the porch, wearing my neatly pressed Marine uniform, and hand him a warm mug. He looks up at me with a smile that radiates pure pride and love. On the small wooden table between us sits a beautifully framed, restored photograph of my mother. For 25 years, her memory was shrouded in a painful silence. But today, her name is spoken with immense honor and gratitude in our home. We no longer have to hide from the past. The truth has set us free, and her unbroken legacy is now the very foundation of our future. The $45 million inheritance completely changed our financial reality, allowing me to secure the absolute best medical care for my father and establish a permanent trust for his peaceful retirement. But as I stand beside him, looking out at our quiet neighborhood, I realize that the true value of my journey to Berlin wasn't the money. The greatest inheritance I received was the truth, the restoration of my mother's honor, and the profound realization that justice and integrity will always triumph over corruption if you refuse to compromise your values. I am still Staff Sergeant Clara Company, a Marine dedicated to serving her country, but I am also a daughter who stood her ground, faced the storm, and brought her family back into the light. This story teaches us a powerful moral lesson. True honor cannot be bought, sold, or buried by power and wealth. Sometimes, life forces us to face difficult choices where the easy path requires us to sacrifice our integrity. But when we stand tall, hold on to our values, and fight for the people we love with dignity and truth, we discover a strength within ourselves that no amount of corruption can ever break. Hard times may test us, but our character is what ultimately defines our victory. What do you think of Clara's journey of honor and forgiveness? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect the people you love? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this emotional family drama inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful, uplifting stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.